The legal challenges against the government's Covid-19 regulations appear to be mounting. In the latest potential bid, Sakeliga, which is a business organization, has informed the government of its intention to have the health regulations set aside. They argue that these regulations will harm social stability, trust and cohesion. For more on this, let's bring in Sakeliga CEO, Piet le Roux, who joins us via our video link this morning. And Piet, it's lovely to have you on the program. Thanks as always for making time. So you wrote a letter, according to my understanding, to the President and the Health Minister, essentially threatening to go to court if these regulations aren't scrapped. Have you received any response yet?
We've not received a response. Our attorneys sent a letter to the President and to Minister Joe Pachla, saying that we intend to litigate. These regulations are constitutionally untenable and for many other reasons should be rejected. We'd like to speak to them. We've perused the applications brought by AfriForum and Solidarity. Those have a lot of merit, but we wish to bring additional legal scrutiny onto this case. We think it's an important moment in society. It's a very important moment, and these health regulations need to be set aside. We cannot allow a permanent state of disaster under some other guise to be maintained in this country. A lot of problems face us, but we cannot add these regulations to that burden. So unless the President or Minister Pachla engages with us in a satisfactory manner before the 18th of May, we intend to litigate.
Yeah, what you've just said is important. You say the regulations are constitutionally untenable. Unpack that for us. What do you mean?
Well, for one, the regulations have some problems, including consultation periods and so on. But most importantly, at a constitutional level, a constitutional order in a society presupposes and requires a division of power, a division of authority, and a vibrant civil society. And what these regulations are doing is they are centralizing the power to make everyday judgments in the hands of bureaucrats. So we face now the moment, the possibility that at every moment, new health regulations can be promulgated, telling us what we can buy, what we cannot buy, who we can receive in our homes and who we cannot. And specifically the current regulations, they make civil society, churches, businesses, schools, universities, all organizations of civil society are made enforcement agents of the state. Now, it may or may not be good to vaccinate. It may not be good to mask. Sakeliga takes no position on these things because they are subjects of science and experience and learning, and positions on them change over time. What we say is that we cannot be made the enforcement agents of the state for things such as whatever they decide to regulate, because then there is no division of power between society, and we pit the sectors of society against each other. And we've seen with riots and crime in South Africa how often society can be turned against business, or how we can see our churches who now have to decide who they can let in their doors or not, and how they can congregate, or schools or political parties. These are all organs of society that need to be free to gather, to organize themselves, and to provide for a balanced society. And that's why it's so constitutionally important. If we let these regulations pass, we will permanentize, we will make permanent a situation that was supposed to be temporary to slow the spread, to flatten the curve. We are facing making the regulations that we saw for the past 2 years become a permanent feature of society.
Several things coming out of that. You say that these regulations, in part, make ordinary organizations enforcers of the law, and you say it's the state that should be enforcing this law. Help us better understand that, because, I mean, for one, how is it any different to how things have worked until this point? Labor law, for instance, requires each individual organization to ensure that they're adhering to those regulations, which are, of course, sanctioned by the state.
Yes. So within each organization, for example, labor law, there are aspects of life, of conduct that are guided by law, that are held together by law. This is nothing new. But what we're seeing here is that public health regulations are made to be, we as society are made to maintain and enforce public, shall we say, enforce public aspects of law. And things that have nothing to do with the workplace itself. It's a feature of society whether or not COVID-19 poses a threat. And COVID-19 does pose a threat, but now, according to Professor Shaber Mahdi and many health experts across the world, It poses a similar threat to influenza-like viruses, since now more than 80% of the population have been exposed. So if at this level of threat we allow for government to dictate what society should do and how the organs of society should monitor the public and how they can congregate and not, then we are going into a new kind of society, a society that at any moment, and we've seen our President Ramaphosa and others regulate by midnight and late night announcements, and the next day the whole country should fall in line. If we allow that to become a permanent feature, we have a different kind of constitutional order, and I would say one that I would scarcely call constitutional anymore. Remember, it was under the expectation of an emergency that emergency powers were adopted. But now, 2 years later, it's not an emergency situation anymore. And we cannot now simply, under a new act, the Health Act, continue with the same regulations that we had under the emergency. Correct? President Ramaphosa and many others have said there is no longer an emergency. That's why we don't have a state of disaster anymore. And what we now say is it's time to return to normal.
I'm not sure if I'm any clearer around the question I asked, Piet. The government has always said regulations that govern our behavior, that in some instances even limit our behavior. What I'm trying to get to the bottom of is how are these regulations in their current form any different to what the government has always done?
Government does not set on the ability of the public to congregate rules and regulations that prohibits these. If a church wanted to get together over all of history, governments did not tell it, except totalitarian governments who wanted to oppress religions, for example. Governments never interfered with that. Businesses could allow onto their premises anybody except where there were imminent threats. What we're now seeing is a government creating rules where there are no criminal actions, where there are no imminent threats, just simply new rules that society need to enforce on things that are considered to be the everyday freedoms of people in their normal course of life. Criminal behavior, behavior on imminent threats, these have all been part of societies forever. But what we're seeing, and it's a nuance, but it's an important nuance, is a government regulating and prohibiting normal actions of everyday life. And if we allow it, even if we may say it doesn't seem too burdensome, if we allow the principle, then 6 months from now, maybe we again see regulations that say what we may buy and may not buy, warm chicken or cold chicken or open shoes or not. We've seen these before under the emergency acts that made room for them. But even though there's no emergency now, we're seeing the same kind of regulations continue. Right. That means we're permanentizing the state of disaster, and that cannot be accepted.
Right. Obviously, people see differently where we are. You've mentioned how we're no longer in an emergency. The WHO feels we're not necessarily out of the woods either. In the event that we do see some kind of potential calamity, if it's not through regulations that government can control the pandemic, what does Sakeliga say about what they should do?
If there's an emergency, there are acts that make room for that. You can have states of emergency, or you can have states of disaster. And that is the correct way to approach a phenomenon where it poses a disaster or an emergency. But precisely the reason why there is no longer a state of disaster is because the government realized that it's impossible to maintain that, and that a court will set that aside. And so a number of organizations, including Sakeliga, were litigating against that because we're saying it was no longer rational to maintain a state of emergency. We must not be under the impression, my understanding, and I think the everyday understanding here, the correct one, should be that current medical science and technology does not allow for us to eradicate something like COVID-19. There are many diseases that have been with humanity for millennia, and when new variations of this theme come and we see pandemics and we see increases in deaths and hospitalizations, that will again happen. Whether that will be from COVID-19 or not, I do not know. But there are many diseases in South Africa that cause multiple times the lives of COVID-19, and we do not declare a state of emergency for them. So as Professor Shabar Mahdi and others point out, Now that more than 80% of people have been exposed to COVID-19, now that we have an enhanced level of natural immunity, we must accept that we will see this as a feature of society. COVID-19 will, again, we can keep testing, we can keep counting the numbers. Sure. From time to time, there will be increases, but it's no longer a state of emergency.
Piet le Roux is the CEO of Sakeliga. Piet, thanks very much indeed for giving us your take on this. Appreciate your time.